think it's interesting to note that each of these early thinkers in education has sort of, or most of them anyway, have followers still today who have an educational philosophy that's rooted in their thinking, but has also developed over time and has its own kind of quirks and dogmas and ways of doing things. So that there are literally Waldorf paint colors that if you're working with a Waldorf school, they may ask you to use. I think from my standpoint and from what we're trying to do today, we're not really trying to promote any one design approach or educational philosophy, but we're going to talk about how on any given project and with any given group of educators, the team of designers and educators working together can really produce a space that supports better childhoods and better early education. The other piece that is always present in today's design projects is regulations and rules. And especially here in the United States, where we have a very litigious society and a very rules-driven society, there is a lot of, for any given project for children, there's a lot of rules to follow and to understand. And I think historically, and once again, this is not a long history of childcare design, the fact that building codes think of early education as either similar to schools for older children, most of 2 years, 9 months and up in most places, fitting into the educational use group. So tend to push them to look like schools for older children, or for the very youngest children, they're in the institutional use group, which tends to push them to look in some ways more like hospitals or jails or institutional buildings. So I think I don't want to put up regulations as the enemy of good design, but they're certainly something that has to be understood and dealt with, so that the things that make sense for children also align with the things that are safe and meet the regulations, which while over time we've managed to change some regulations through just advocacy work and things like that. We're not really going to change a lot of them, so we need to learn to work with them. So that's another thing we'll talk about today. The history of then architects getting involved with early education has been sometimes very successful, sometimes less successful. On the left-hand upper left is a project by Robert Venturi for a children's museum where it's really kind of a caricature of, this children, he found a way to say that this was a place for children, but it wasn't a very subtle way. And the lower left, this is a Walter Gropius project for a childcare center in Massachusetts from the 1940s, which really sort of took the style of building that Gropius and the Architects Collaborative were designing at the time and just kind of put children into it. And then on the right is an image some of you may have seen before. It's a mega childcare center in Japan, which is has some really interesting and cool things about it, but it's really an architectural form that's imposed on this program. It's not really related to the site, and it's not really related to the fact that it's a place for children, but then it is adapted in an interesting way. So I think one of the things that we're hoping that you get out of today is the beginnings of thinking about what kind of a framework can you put together for your projects, and how might that change for any given project. So one of the things we wanted to talk about is some resources that are out there in terms of books about childcare spaces. Whoops, let me go back again. So none of these books were written by architects. Well, I take it back. One of these books was written by, no, I take it back. Two of these books, sorry, two of these books were written by architects and one by a landscape architect. And a lot of the good work on children's environments has come from outside of the design space. But I think this is one place to start. These are all sort of classic texts, I would say. And I'll go through and talk a little bit about each one of them. And then the last one on the right is one that Brian's going to talk about a little bit more when he focuses a little bit more on outdoor spaces after this. So Childcare Design Guide by Anita Olds was, I think, came out in 2001. And it's a very useful book, I think, for designers getting into understanding how childcare functions. It really thinks about the house as a model for a childcare. So it comes at it from the idea that the ideal place for children is a sort of a domestic environment that is, warm and friendly and fuzzy and tactile. And I think there's a lot to learn from this. It's very much written from an experiential point of view. It's really about how do children experience the space, and how can you think about tying it back into the vision of a home. Obviously, when you start thinking about different cultures and different places geographically, not everybody's home is like your home or like Anita's home was. So I think none of these resources are perfect, but I think they're really informative. And this book especially has a lot of really good reflections on classrooms and how they function. And it's interesting because these are not all new books. And I would say that while there are innovations in early education, there are a lot of constants as well. So I think these are still really valuable. So in our work, I was just going to show one project. We're always trying to balance this idea of a home-like, welcoming space with the idea of an educational space where, educators are professionals and they're doing a job that's valued, and parents understand that even though children are learning through play, it is a place where, learning and development is happening. This is a project for Boston University, where we actually were able to renovate an old historic home into a childcare center with an addition. You can see the addition on the right. So I think it was really interesting for us to think about that balance. On the left-hand side, one of the historic spaces that we retained almost as is and turned into just a large play space. And on the right, a room that was a combination of several smaller rooms to create a classroom, retaining some of the historical elements like the fireplace, and some of the feel of the wood floors and the molding details, but still making it functional and making it feel like a sort of an up-to-date children's learning environment. And then in the addition, we tried to sort of do a different take on that feel, something that was compatible but not a historical knockoff, really. And in the outdoor spaces, there was a beautiful yard essentially. So we worked really carefully with our landscape team to try to maintain the feel of a domestic space and the connection between house and garden that worked at the child scale and included a lot of natural elements. The next book that I'm going to talk about is Caring Spaces, Learning Places by Jim Greenman. And this is a kind of a classic text about how children and families go through childcare and relate to childcare, and how important the early years of life are. Jim had his roots as a teacher and educator, but was a real expert on children's environments and how teachers use those environments and how children use those environments. I think this book tries really hard not to be prescriptive about the way something is approached. Different, I would say, than, for example, educators from a Waldorf or a Montessori background might approach their spaces in terms of supporting their curriculum. There's certain things that are really important to those models. But the Caring Spaces, Learning Places book is much more open-ended, but I think it's very useful. As I said, if we are trying to create a framework for ourselves for good design for children. So at the heart of that, I think, is just the idea that childhood is just an incredibly important time in the development of individuals, and it just really values space and environment in a way that I think society as a whole, and not all people involved in childcare projects, do. So I think this book is also a good teaching tool in projects as you are going through and trying to emphasize how important good design really is, and how important thoughtful, well-detailed spaces for children to be in and to play in and to interact in are. I think it also is really clear about the fact that that environments, indoor and outdoor environments, are really key pieces to quality education. That if it's not supporting the pedagogical program, and if it's not helping teachers to do their jobs and giving children opportunities to interact with a wide range of sensory environments and places to be, then it's probably holding back what could be the quality of the overall experience for children and families. He really embraced the idea, which comes from the Reggio Emilia tradition, of the environment as the third teacher. So the teachers and the family, and then the environment actually as being a key part of that educational structure for children. And that really is part of the second bullet, and how does the environment support quality? Because young children learn through experience and not through being, quote unquote, taught. They're not listening to lectures and studying and taking tests. They're dropping things and jumping off of things and touching things and interacting with their peers and teachers and families. But really also the environment, the color, the light, all of those things. So I think this, his book gives an interesting, sort of very roundabout, almost poetic take on what's important about environments. So I think it gets at things that are not always obvious from a designer's point of view. Robin Moore, this book was Robin Moore and Herb Wong, but Robin Moore went on to write a bunch of other books and now runs the Natural Learning Institute at North Carolina State University in Raleigh. And this book was really, one of the first to emphasize the importance of natural outdoor experiences for children, and the idea that the outdoor space can be more kind of a living space and less of a play space that was only about physical activity and only about sort of protecting children in a physically active environment. I think over the last 50 years, we went from traditions of sort of playing in nature in the woods on the one hand, and adventure play with building things and making things on the other, to a tradition of kind of built climbing and sliding and swinging equipment that was then made safer by using lots of protective surfacing and things. So This book is a really great introduction to sort of where the thinking about nature play comes from. Eric Nelson's book, Cultivating Outdoor Classrooms, is very specific and really, really good about outdoor learning, I think, and thinking about the fact that early education can happen outdoors. This comes partly from the fact that he lives in Southern California. But I think it's really informative to us in the Northeast as well. We just have to think differently about it in the winter time. When I refer here to the California model, I think Eric and other architects and landscape architects and designers in California have developed a model which is really interesting, which basically has no indoor circulation. So you kind of can go from classroom to classroom to classroom by going outside, which is obviously trickier in other parts of the country. But it lends itself to this real indoor-outdoor flow. And I think we can all learn a lot from this, certainly in our work, working together with our architecture team and our landscape team. We really do try to integrate the two and to think about how the inside informs the outside and how the outside informs the inside. The final book that I'm going to talk about is Children's Spaces and Relations. And this is a book written by Giulio Seppi and Michele Zini, and I think mostly Michele Zini, who's an architect in Modena, Italy. And it's definitely a book written for architects by architects. It's a little bit written in Architectese, and that's compounded by the fact that it's translated from Italian, I think. But if you dig into it, it has some very, very useful ideas, which I think we've certainly taken and adapted and tried to use, and I think they're great for everybody. They revolve around relational forms, rich normality, and multisensoriality, which we'll break down a little bit in the next couple of slides. So relational form, and so Michele's background is he's deeply rooted in the Reggio Emilia tradition, which is Reggio Emilia is a town in northern Italy, which post World War II has developed a really innovative preschool system and preschool philosophy and pedagogy. And they are very tied to their to the physical environment. Such things as all of their schools have a central piazza. They all have ateliers, or multiple ateliers, so studio spaces where children can do long-term projects. And then the idea of horizontal connections and a sort of open flow from space to space. Some of these things are difficult to achieve in the US given licensing regulations, but I think there's a lot of Reggio-inspired programs which use these ideas. This is a studio project space that we designed at Clemson University. And I think the idea of relational form, the idea that there are going to be spaces which are key to the educational program of whoever the project is being, is really important. And I think it'll be different for each project. So it could be centralized on outdoor spaces, it could be different kinds of indoor spaces, or it could be somehow related to a more formal curriculum. But I think it's a piece of setting up a framework for designing any project that can be really useful and important. The idea of rich normality is a concept that we've really sort of latched onto and like a lot, because when you walk into a lot of children's spaces, you'll either see sort of bright primary colors, or a space that feels very, very stimulating, or some spaces are very, especially some spaces where architects have tread, are very sort of clean and white and pristine. And so I think it's not easy to find the right balance. And I'm not sure that this image necessarily is the right balance, but I think it's something that to me resonates because it's brings the outdoors in, which informs allows the indoors to be simpler, I think, because there's so much interesting sensory activity going on outside. It uses natural materials. It uses relatively simple muted colors. And it's organized without being rigid, I guess is how I would say it. But once again, we're kind of just, throwing out these parameters and ideas in the hopes that each one of you will, latch on to some of them in some of your projects and that they'll be useful. The idea of multi-sensoriality is summarized in these sensory scapes, which also comes from McKelly's book. So some of them are really obvious, like a Lightscape, but they're, I think, really useful concepts, both for designing, but also just for talking about design with clients and with funders and people who are involved in the projects. So the Lightscape one is the kind of the easiest one, I think, for me to talk about in a historical sense, because when I first started out in architecture, lighting design was very much a quantitative engineering practice. It was about, how many foot candles or how many lumens do you need on the desk, and how many lights does it take to get that. Whereas the concept of thinking about a lightscape is all about quality of light, and different sources and controllability. On the left-hand side, you see a space for very young children, where sometimes they turn on all the lights except the light table, which you see here, and these little colored lights. And sometimes they have on a lot of lights, and sometimes there's interesting shadows. And the space on the right is an art studio in the Nursery Learning Laboratory in Jamaica Plain in Boston. And here, while there is artificial lighting, a lot of the focus, this is on the north side of the building, a lot of the focus is on how the natural lighting is managed. So there's a tall space here on an upper level, which is very much top lit by clear story lighting. And then there's a north facing window in the part that's mostly used for painting for the kids. And then there's control for the natural light and for the artificial light. So it's the idea that there's a lightscape that is both varied and can be sort of controlled and manipulated. So the idea of a chromoscape is the idea that children, if you think about children learning about color, there's kind of two ways that you could approach it. You could say, well, there's red, green, blue, and yellow. Or you could say there's, almost an infinite number of reds and greens and blues and yellows, and there's a difference in hue and a difference in texture and a difference in saturation and transparency. And so it's really about, once again, introducing color in a controlled but really mindful way. And there's, color that's actually integral to what it comes from, like the color of the wood or the plants. There's applied color. Here you can see some of the color has light coming through it. And just, I think, also looking for opportunities, like this exterior fence, to introduce color where you might not necessarily otherwise think of it. And this is a corner of this playground. This is for MIT. And most of the fence of the playground is what you see over here, black vinyl coated chain link fence. And that's there because it serves the purpose of keeping children in and other people out, and it's inexpensive and durable. But at this particular corner, what we did, both to shield the playground from the parking lot and to kind of add to the colorscape and the light and shadow, was to build a little bit of a more intricate fence. So I think it's, looking for opportunities like this to impact the chromoscape both inside and out that are worth having on your list, worth having on your set of parameters and keeping in mind. So we got to find a better word for Materialscape, but Materialscape, or just the materiality of a space, are very important for young children, and that really especially goes for the places that are down at children's level, or the materials that are down at children's level. This is at the Penn State University Childcare Center, and where there is a bamboo floor. And one of the interesting things about, a cork floor. There are bamboo floors in other rooms, but this one has a cork floor. One of the interesting things about this is that the teachers have latched on to the idea that this is a cork floor, and so they've integrated cork into their curriculum. So children learn the properties of cork, the density, and that it floats. And they learn about how cork is sustainably harvested in Portugal every 5 years from the trees, and then it grows back. And once again, if we just go back to the idea that children start out learning by their experience. So the experience of just seeing the pattern of the cork floor and the feel of the cork floor and how that's different than a concrete floor or something else. And then by being able to have teachers who can leverage that and take that to the next step and learn about geography and sustainability and science all through these connections is a really, for us, the really interesting place to take the design. Aromascape, I think, is something that is often under appreciated. So there's pleasing odors like the flowers, and then there's just things inside like odor control have to do with ventilation and operable windows and things like that. But I think just being conscious of what the aromascape is like is really important. I mean, this can impact things like if there's a kitchen where they're cooking meals, is it something that's a back of house thing that's out of the way where you don't see it? Or is it something because of the amazing aromas coming out of the kitchen that you want to put front and center? And there's not a right answer to that question, but it's something that can be considered in the context of these sensoryscapes. Soundscapes, once again, is also something where there's sort of a positive and a negative potential, right? Being able to have places where children can make sound and being able to have spaces that are acoustically varied so that you can have some lively acoustical spaces and some other spaces, but where acoustical control is in place where it's needed so that crying babies, should there be a crying baby, aren't waking up the napping toddlers next door, or so that private conversations between teachers and parents can happen in private offices. All of those things are important, and I think they're a part of the soundscape. And certainly, we've seen a lot of spaces for children where the not paying enough attention to the soundscape has really impacted the functionality of the spaces. So tactile qualities, both happen as part of what children do, but also obviously as a part of the materiality of the center or the materiality of the indoor and outdoor spaces. And I think one of the important things there, and it goes back to talking about materials and their tactile qualities, I think, is that we all work, whether we like it or not, within a construction economy that's not driven by sensory richness. Our construction economy is really driven by cost and at some level by durability, and now, thankfully, at some level by sustainability. But I think making choices about materials that children come into contact where we can balance safety and variety and tactile interest is another piece of putting together a really interesting place for children. Gustatory, so we're thinking about, I guess, a lot of outdoor spaces now, but thinking about, obviously the plants are first and foremost non-toxic, but afterwards, are they things that can actually be harvested and eaten, and what are the possibilities there? There's other sensory parameters that I think we're only kind of starting to explore. Proprioception having to do with balance and movement through space, and vestibular stimulation, which is also balance related, but comes from stimulation of the inner ear. A lot of that comes from sort of swinging and swaying and swirling motions. So once again, a lot of this we're talking about outdoor activities. Internal regulation comes from, it just has to do with how your body regulates itself, or how children's bodies regulate themselves. And those have to do both with kind of interior climatic comfort, but also with designing so that you limit stress in children, and there are safe spaces to go to and to be in. And comfortable spaces for large groups, but also comfortable spaces for smaller groups and for individuals. And finally, and you'll see that we've kind of expanded on McKelly's list, and I'm optimistic that you will all expand on this list as well as you go through projects. But the idea of interior microclimates, this is shots from a greenhouse that we built at the Epiphany School in Dorchester in Boston, which has just become a real key part of their curriculum, both for younger children and for middle schoolers, actually, because they have both at this school. And both the fact that it's just such a different environment in the greenhouse, it's warm and humid, and it's rich with plants, and different smells and odors. They use it for so many different things. They use it for calming kids down when they're overstimulated. They use it for small group activities, and then of course they use it for sort of normal greenhouse function as a part of a big gardening project that they have. And then also the idea of, on any site, thinking about natural microclimates. This is a picture of the Penn State Childcare Center at Hort Woods. And in this case, it was right on the edge of a big wooded area. So the woods is on the north side of the building, and it's post-construction. There can be as much as a 10 to 12 degree temperature swing on the cool side of the building as on the south, warm side of the building. The building's natural ventilation system actually relies on that to cool the building for up to 120 days a year. But in addition to that, the building sort of was designed to emphasize the microclimate, so that there's the courtyard that you're looking at in the center of the picture was really thought of as the cool courtyard. That's the place in the summer, when it's hot outside, where we save these big trees and we're shading it from the south sun. And I think the idea that we were able to kind of discover and maintain and enhance those little microclimates on site means that there's just a richer sensory environment for the children all around the building. So once again, I think one of our goals for today is for everybody to be able to go back, and as they're approaching a project, and as they're approaching multiple projects, to sort of be able to take and create a framework. And obviously, there are things on this list that we haven't talked about. We talked about sensoryscapes, the idea of a welcoming space, and that may mean different things in different communities for different people. Safety and security are always and should always be paramount. So safety is really, at some level, common sense, keeping sharp objects away from children. And security, on the other hand, which is a bigger concern now than it probably was 15 or 20 years ago, is something that's also worth thinking about, just in terms of access control. And once upon a time, we didn't design classrooms to be locked at all, and now they're all designed to be locked from the inside if there's a lockdown situation. access to nature and the idea that some schools may really have either little or no need for interior space. There are nature preschools that spend 90% of the time outside. So there are nature preschools that spend 100% of their time outside, but most of them are not located in the US. Currently, we're doing a couple of projects for Mass Audubon. They have outdoor preschools. And so they're really trying to do minimal indoor space so that the programs can be licensed and so that they can support the outdoor play. But I think they see the key functions that happen inside are really like the clothes dryers and the microwave and the refrigerator. And they really want to focus what's going on outside. So that's another approach. The idea of transformability and flexibility, can be very important to some programs and to some projects. I think there's ways to build flexibility into classrooms so that different age groups can use them successfully. And I think there's also ways to build so that buildings can be more easily transformed over time. We are really only, recently digging into trauma-informed design. So thinking about what kinds of spaces to children who've gone through traumatic experiences, such as homelessness, what things do they really need that are different than other children? I think that's a really interesting topic to dig into. And just a whole range of other somewhat redundant on this page bullets. But the idea of child autonomy and to what extent do we want children to be able to control their own environments? And, that has to do with putting things at child height and making systems accessible in a mindful way so that maybe children can dim the lights, or maybe they can't, depending on the approach of the team involved on the pedagogical side of a project.
So let's take a look at a more focused portion of the outdoors. Mike had talked a bit about outdoor design and playscapes, but we're just going to dive a little bit deeper into how crucial it is for a child's development to have allotted time for being outside. In every culture, childhood's a special time. It's probably the most powerful period of our lives. Experiences from the core of our being, our sense of ourselves in relation to the world of nature, of people, of things. It's a time for powerful experiences that forever fuel that astronaut, the scientist, the artist, and just the imagination within us. The outdoors provides a means for children to learn through unstructured activities, giving them the freedom to dictate how they spend their time and what activities they would like to do. It offers possibilities for intellectual, emotional, social, spiritual, and physical development. It develops capacities for creativity and problem solving. It helps to reduce stress and symptoms of attention deficit disorder. And it supports a child's sense of self and recognizing independence, interdependence, and connectedness with their natural world. And the image here is of the Chestnut Hill School, and they were actually wanted to eliminate that tree. So thankfully they didn't. All right, I have control now. One second. Okay. Cool. So when thinking about a play space for children, those aspects from the previous slide should be considered, and it can help to create goals towards designing an effective outdoor space. Allowing time and space for free play, just giving children time to be outside isn't really enough. They should have a space that encourages them to explore different kinds of play and develop different skills. And this isn't just for centers and providers, but for anyone really, just like taking a child to a park or a field on the weekend or after school. Providing a variety of natural and built environments is really important. Offering risk challenges to push a child out of their comfort zone to help build self-confidence. Encouraging cooperative play, whether through dramatic play or an activity that can have multiple children engaged. This helps to build on social skills and the sense of discovery of giving children the tools to engage in their surroundings and to help nurture an appreciation for nature and the outdoors. providing time and space for free play. So here are just some examples of playgrounds that provide enough elements to spark curiosity in the children without really giving them guidance on how the playground should be used. And these are very open and provide at least a climber if possible to help with upper body and gross motor development. Some spaces like in the bottom left, the space was limited, and so it didn't allow us to put a climber there. But you can see on the image to the right that just doing a design with the surfacing could be an effective method to engage children without having to minimize the available open space. And these spaces just really provide children with the opportunity and freedom of unstructured play, which is just very important for their developing imagination and creativity. Free play. So here are just some more examples of how open, unoccupied space can be taken advantage of with just loose parts or building blocks or just toys, providing children with an opportunity for cooperative and dramatic play. It's important because it lets children play out their fantasies in scenarios that they don't fully comprehend yet, and helping to develop their communication and language skills to unite and work together as a team towards a common goal. Now we have providing a variety of environments. So a well-designed playground should just provide multiple areas for different activities for the children. Some areas should allow children to develop their upper body strength and gross motor skills, like larger pieces of equipment that you would typically see in a playground. Other areas should just allow children to engage in dramatic and role playing, strengthen the child's creativity and some social skills. And this can be accomplished through musical instruments and just providing a backdrop or a stage that children can use and kind of gets their imagination going. And just reiterating on what was shown in the previous slides, it's important to provide open space to provide or to run around and use loose materials and equipment to engage the children in these creative and cooperative activities. The image to the top right isn't actually a project that we worked on, but I thought it would be good to show because it was built to be completely inclusive and it succeeds in providing a variety of play. All the different areas of the playground can be accessed through this winding red path along the perimeter. And the path slopes up and down to be able to access the lower courtyard and the higher embankment slide. So now we're going to talk about one of the texts that Mike had touched on earlier. It's The Inward Garden and The Magic Land. These were both written by landscape architect Julie Meimer-Servey. And she talks essentially about this framework in her books. And she's mostly applying this framework to gardens, but it's an idea that can be applied to play spaces and really any sort of built environment as well. And she categorizes these different aspects of a garden into the 7 spatial archetypes. And these are just forms that we all love and are inherently comfortable with. They're fundamental forms that we can find in all of nature and all built form. And sometimes these archetypes can also be achieved through activities as well. So it's not just only built form. And now we'll run through each one. Let's see. So the first archetype that Julia refers to is a form in which you immerse yourself in. It arouses your senses. It's surrounding yourself in an atmosphere or engaging in an activity. So in these images, you can see children playing with water, trying to create a dam or trying to redistribute the path for the flow of the water. On the right, you can see children going on a walk or a hike through a forest. They're just surrounding themselves in the activity that they're engaged in. And just diving a little bit further, here's some just more examples of spaces that allow you to immerse yourself in the space around you. So the image on the left is the Toronto Music Garden. It's actually designed by the author Julie Meimer-Servey, and she worked in collaboration with famous cellist Yo-Yo Ma. The images support that this idea of surrounding yourself with music and flowers. And on the right, you can see that the children are engaged in playing with instruments and just creating music. The cave. So the next archetype is this idea of the cave is to provide a space or an element to help you find your focus. An area that provides privacy or seclusion. It's finding shelter in a form-fitting place. She puts it as somewhere with a window to the world. So it could be anything like a woodland hut or a playhouse. It could be a tunnel that children could crawl through or hang out inside. And This idea can even be applied to something like a front porch where you're just encapsulated all around, but you're still open to your surroundings. And these are spaces that give you a sense of isolation without shutting you out from the rest of the world. And this can kind of go back to trauma-informed design especially for children that are on the autism spectrum. We obviously want to promote socialization, but we also want to give children spaces, just their own personal space for when they feel they need to retreat a bit. Safe harbor is a space that gives you a feeling of embracing someone and being embraced. It's something that makes you feel safe and relaxed. It offers sanctuary and quiet refuge. These are spaces where you erect boundaries to define your realm of refuge. It could be a bench surrounded by plants. It can be a wing chair. It could even be something like a booth at a restaurant or at a bar. And the image on the top left is of the Boston University Childcare Center that we looked at earlier. This idea of a safe harbor can be applied to both on the deck above with the railing surrounding it, or to the space below it, which is a little more private, even though it's open on the sides. The promontory. It's an elevated area that just essentially functions as a lookout. And it's this idea of exploring the edge, of standing at the brink and feeling the excitement and danger of just going beyond your comfort zone. So it could be something like the top of a hill or a tall climbing structure. It can even be loosely applied to something like the idea of a second floor deck or a balcony. And this archetype goes back to helping to develop a child's self-confidence. And the image to the right is of the Franklin Park Zoo. The island is this idea about creating smaller formations that provide you with a sense of ownership. It gives you the sense of becoming the center of that space and having control over it. It allows you to know yourself by finding time and space for yourself, building on this sense of ownership. As you can see in the images, when a child's occupying one of these island formations, it's kind of difficult for another child to be able to access it until they moved on. It also provides this experience of crossing a bridge or transitioning from one space to another. The mountain is this idea of providing elevated areas to gain perspective. It gives this feeling of being protected yet free by occupying a high place. It's about enjoying the journey upward while being able to look back at your progress and gaining a new view to the world. It opens you to see things you might not have or couldn't have seen from below. So some of these can be forms like a rocky hill. It could be like these embankment slides that you see in the images. It could be a tall tree or a tree house. It's really the physical action of actually climbing and getting to the top. It's this feeling of accomplishment. And you can see that in the bottom right image where most of the children in the image are near the top of the hill. The last spatial archetype is this idea that the sky is about finding your bliss. It's bringing the sky to earth and leaving the landscape far below. So things like when you're looking up at the sky or at a tree, it gives you this sense of wonder and grandness. Being able to provide a space to lay on the grass or on a hammock and just be able to stare up at the sky. Could even be something like a mirror like you see in the middle image, or just a reflecting pool, just to provide a new perspective. It's about providing opportunity to be able to pause and absorb the scenery around you and letting you connect with nature. Risk-taking challenges. So now, diverging from the archetypes, there are some aspects of the playground that should be taken into consideration when choosing equipment and layout. So one goal that was touched on earlier is providing risk challenges. Your goal should be, when designing a playground, to provide the highest amount of risk with the lowest amount of hazards that can lead to injury. And this helps to strengthen the child's confidence. It develops upper body strength and gross motor skills, and it encourages communication and socialization, as you can see in some of these images. And just continuing, looking at some more examples. Here you can see images of a larger climbing equipment that gives the children the freedom to approach it really however they see fit. it allows them to work together and to take turns so that everyone can really participate and have fun as a team, really. And actually in the back slide, the back on the left image is this custom slide that we designed, which is actually this 10-foot wide slide at the Fairweather School. Building on social skills. So now we're going to look at this idea of cooperation and looking at how the outdoors can help children with developing social skills in an unstructured environment. So to the left, you can see loose parts and building blocks that allow the children to work together towards a common goal. And another form is just really competitive and team-based games are a great way to get children engaged. It's a more structured activity, but it might be something that they already enjoy and are familiar with. And the top right, you can see another image of that slide I talked about previously. And just some more instances of building social skills. So here are just some more examples of how children can communicate with each other just to participate in the same activities. If you provide enough of a setting, then really the child's imagination can take over for dramatic play and role playing. Not sure why it's not going to the next slide. Okay. Place to discover. So gardens and play spaces should spark curiosity in children to be able to push them and to try and discover new things or explore new areas, which is why it's so important to provide a variety of environments. As you know, every child's different. They'll have different activities that may interest them more than another child, and you just have to be prepared for that sort of program. And continuing on that, these areas should encourage them to leave their comfort zone. It should allow them to surround themselves and be able to engage in an activity. And this can really kind of be connected back to this idea that Julie promoted with 7 archetypes, you know, whether through built form or just through activities. Now, just discovering nature. In terms of really discovering nature, it's important to give children an opportunity to be able to connect back with the outdoors. These moments are really the one time during their day when they have a chance to be outside and surround themselves in a natural environment. So a playground shouldn't really just be about having a piece of equipment to climb on and that's just surrounded by poured rubber or safety surfacing. You know, things like a plant palette, plants and trees, they really have a large impact on the atmosphere of the space and can provide a lot of unintended activities for the children that you hadn't really thought of when designing it. So looking at different types of trees with different shaped leaves, and that could be a learning experience for the children as well. Providing plants that have dried seed pods or flexible sticks. These can be used by the children for art and loose play. And these are just things that a child might discover throughout their time on the play yard, whether that was your intention or not. And just to conclude this portion of the session, before we take a short break, I'd just like to reiterate that these ideas of the 7 spatial archetypes introduced by Julie Meservey are just a flexible framework that can be applied to design of playgrounds and garden spaces. But it's not just a rule of thumb where all 7 ideas will always be able to be applied to any space. It just helps to design a space that lets you experience different environments instead of moving just from one piece of equipment to the next. All right, now we'll take a short break.
All right, hopefully everybody can see my screen and can see my presentation. If not, Sam, just go ahead and give me a shout out if it's not working. But before I preface, I just want to preface this with, I definitely feel like I drew the short straw for this presentation. After seeing a lot of the really inspiring images shared by Brian and Mike at studioMLA, I get to bring it back to what I'm sure is going to be the most riveting portion of the day, which is childcare licensing in Rhode Island. Really, all jokes aside, though, for those of you outside of the state, I'm so glad that you're able to attend so that you can see some of the ways that the state is looking at physical space from a licensing perspective. But before getting into some of those specialized regulations, I just wanted to highlight the way that we at LISC like to look at the totality of a building project. There really are 4 elements to a childcare development that need to work together to make a project successful, whether it be new construction, additions to existing spaces, or renovations and retrofits. So we like to look at the site. Is it accessible? Is it safe? Does it have enough land for building and parking and playground? Does the childcare operator have site control or either ownership or through a long-term lease? Is it convenient and accessible for families? Is the use allowed by zoning, which does come up quite a bit in Rhode Island as an issue, and does it have environmental issues? The next component is the building itself. Is it greater than 10,000 square feet? Is it a single level or 2-story with accessibility? Does it have good natural light? Is it easy to add plumbing? Are there few or no interior load-bearing walls for maximum flexibility? And again, environmental issues inside and outside. And then the third component is having the operator. You want to have the right person operating the space. Do they have the desire to expand or relocate? Do they have the capacity to manage a project? Is there sufficient funding or the ability to secure funding? And is there a willingness to hire the right team, the right professionals? And then is there a realistic plan and time frame for this? And the last component, and probably the one that is the biggest Achilles heel for any type of construction project, is the funding. Are there funds for the project alone? So let's start initially with construction. Are there funds for acquisition, carrying cash for the building, pre-development funds, and then cash on hand, of course. And then, it's not just constructing a project, but can you operate the building after the fact? Do you have funds on hand to cover any operating losses for the first 2 to 3 years of your startup? Is there enough cash flow to cover any debt service that was taken on? And then is there enough cash flow for building reserves in the event that something needs to be repaired or replaced imminently? One of our goals is to really help childcare providers who may have never taken on a project piece together these components to create a successful childcare space. All right, so in the next slide that we'll get to, we're going to talk about a new facility timeline. And so please, this is definitely overreaching. And I know that thinking about starting a project 5 years out seems like a long time, but knowing the amount of work that it takes for a group who may not necessarily be attuned to doing a construction project, 4 to 5 years really is our ideal goal in working with a center that wants to expand or create a new space. It's not uncommon for us to get a request from a provider that they want to expand their space or want to move to a new location with a goal of being open in 3 to 6 months. We like to work with childcare providers on understanding the full context of a building facility, setting the stage for playing a long game when it comes to developing a program. In an ideal world, and I know this isn't always the reality, we like to start working with our childcare providers 4 to 5 years out in order to do an in-depth view of the organization's goals, their overall business and master plan, and also to test out the financial strength that they have to take on a project. And after that, begin working on figuring out what the design options are and what the potential costs would be with a more realistic 2 to 3 year design and construction phase, while also emphasizing the importance of hiring the right professionals. We believe, and we try to educate our providers on, architects, engineers, and attorneys are really an investment in the quality of a project. Now onto the fun part. More so than any other use that I've seen, childcare has a significantly high amount of regulations and standards that need to be met in order to ensure the health and safety of children. Start adding in best practices and the desire for the space to be seen as high quality. Those standards grow and really do extend beyond your typical building code. So this is a little wheel that I've put together that shows all the different regulations and standards that groups tend to have to look at. The first is the DHS 2019 regulations, and they are the baseline standards for childcare licensing. We'll talk a little bit more about those in particular in just a bit. The next is the CECE regulations. It's the Comprehensive Early Childhood Education Program standards. Those are the standards that are used by state-funded pre-K groups. Then there's the basic education program for pre-Ks that are located within K through 12 buildings. And then you have the Rhode Island State Building Code. And for those of you outside of the state, The SBC is actually built off of the International Building Code, or IBC, and has been added onto. An interesting item of note here is that childcare can sometimes fall under two different use groups and occupancy classifications, depending on the age of the children and the number of the children being served. This is especially critical to know well in advance because it often has a really big impact on fire safety and egress requirements, depending on the construction type. The next is the NFPA 1 and 101 for the State Fire Marshal's Office. Rhode Island has a very, very strict fire code. Thoughtful code review and life safety assessment will be critical for building planning and for identifying some of those really costly expenses up front. We also have city and town ordinances. We have rules and regulations for school health programs. We have the remediation of hazardous materials releases. And then we have our quality rating system as well, which is the Bright Stars or ECHRS program. And then we have Head Start facility standards for those that are operating Head Start classrooms. And then of course, after all of that is said and done, we still have the best practices and the highest quality things that we can do to our spaces. And I want to go back and quickly talk about those local city, town, and ordinances. Rhode Island is small, but certainly mighty with regard to the number of different municipalities, all 39 of them that we have in the state. Each one has its own unique way of viewing childcare from a zoning perspective. It can become really confusing for groups with multiple locations in different jurisdictions because a building layout will not be a one-size-fits-all solution in different cities and towns. One example that I really like to share that comes up a lot is with parking. In Woonsocket, 2 spaces are required for every 1,000 square feet of gross floor area. But in Cranston, where childcare is actually viewed differently as a school, it's 1 space for each 2 employees. And of course, at the end of the day, you'll just have to also talk to your local authority having jurisdiction, which may add another layer of complication. So I say this just to emphasize that each city and town is going to be very uniquely different in the way that they view childcare, which is different than the way that they view schools. So an architect, engineer, or design professional will be really, really well versed in building, fire, plumbing, electrical, mechanical, and local code. But childcare providers are typically looking at the Childcare Licensing Regulations, which has a special section on physical space that's not really always top of mind for our architects at the start of a project. Every Rhode Island state agency's regulations fall under the Rhode Island Code of Regulations and Title 18, which is the Department of Human Services, and Chapter 70, which is specifically for the Office of Child Care Licensing, is where the Child Care Center and school age program regulations for licensure are housed. I've included a web link at the bottom where you can access all of the DHS regulations, and childcare is in that area. The regulations are intended to be reviewed and updated every 3 years. And actually that process for the next iteration of review will be starting soon. The most recent version in 2019 included a breakout of items required for new childcare programs or licenses versus existing programs or licenses. And this really eliminated any grandfathering of spaces if there was a change of ownership or a transfer of license, often eliminating what we call bad building churn. We obviously don't have time to go through each and everything related to physical space that are noted in the regulations and standards, but this list encompasses the key facility topics that are noted. So we're talking about building condition, health and safety, inspections, site evaluation, building level, exits and egresses, and so on. And what I'd like to spend the next few minutes on are items or issues that consistently come up when DHS reviews floor plans for childcare as part of the licensing application. Ideally, this will help you guys in the planning process prior to submitting to DHS, and also just being highly aware of the things that we see consistently on our end as things to consider when looking at a space for childcare. So section 1.7C14, you don't have to remember that. I can send all of the different kind of regs that we address later, but really one of the biggest issues that we see is around building level and grade. The regulation states that facilities used by children are above grade, as defined by the International Building Code. So not so politely put, this means no babies in the basement. Below grade spaces are considered to be an inferior space because it often doesn't have good natural light. It may be damp or prone to mold, or other environmental concerns may be there too. It is just not an ideal space for the use by young children. So children need to be housed at the story above grade plane. And this is any story having its finished floor surface entirely above the grade plane, or in which the finished surface of the floor next above is either more than 6 feet above the grade plane or more than 12 feet above the finished ground level at any point. These diagrams attempt to illustrate this, just for, for anybody who's going into sites and potentially assessing the feasibility of a space for childcare. One thing that I like to do is, if the grade is in question, is just count the number of stairs that I have to walk down to a space and then measure the floor to ceiling height for a quick assessment. That's just an easy way to mathematically say, like, okay, am I actually 6 feet below grade, or do I have at least 6 feet above grade, to be able to understand what is the building level going to be considered. Another one that comes up quite a bit is direct access outside. The particular regulation around this notes that any classroom used by infants or toddlers must have direct access from the outside of the classroom, or from the classroom to the outside, without the use of stairs or elevators. It's really not so much of an issue for new construction because it can be well planned in the early design phase, but it definitely can be problematic for existing spaces. As you can imagine, for many of Rhode Island's buildings that are, generally constructed from the 1920s to the 1960s, that were built on plinths, this means a lot of cutting out of new doors and a lot of ramping. And that can be quite costly and eat up a lot of precious exterior space. So it's one of the first things that I like to look at in spaces, if it's going to be a reused space or adapted space, is where are the lowest portions to the ground? How can we minimize the amount of ramping that's necessary? What are the best spaces for infants and toddlers that need to have that direct access outside? Plumbing fixtures. So a running joke in childcare design and construction is that it always comes down to toilets. So the IBC plumbing count, according to use and occupancy, does vary from the more stringent DHS requirements. Minimum requirements for childcare licensing include, for preschool classrooms, having 1 toilet and 1 sink for every 10 kiddos located on the same level. For toddlers, having 1 toilet and 1 sink for every 20 located on the same level. For infant and toddler classrooms, within the classroom, you need a diaper changing area and 1 sink exclusively used for hand washing, with another for exclusively used for food preparation. And for school age spaces, you need 1 toilet and 1 sink for every 20 children, separated by boys or girls, or having gender neutral if under 20. And of course, we can't forget about our adults. We definitely need to have a separate adult facility with at least 1 toilet and 1 sink. But really, we really want to stress the importance here of best practice. And that includes having toilet facilities located within the classroom. If they can't be within the classroom, then there should not be a travel distance of greater than 100 feet to the toilet. Additional sinks for food prep and activities should be located within the classroom as well. Many teachers can attest to the negative impact of having to gather a group of kiddos who all may or may not need to use the facilities to stay within ratio, to walk down a hall, losing that incredibly important time for interactions in the classroom. If there's one thing, that I can, really try to hone in on, is that we really want to have those fixtures within the classroom, if at all possible. It is the best thing for kids. It is the best thing for teachers. And it's the thing that keeps people most sane, so that you can focus on the priority of what you want to be doing in the classroom, not taking kids in and out to use the restroom. For natural light in licensing regulations, each infant, toddler, preschool, or school-age classroom in a program needs to have natural light through a wall level window directly within each classroom space that is enough light to provide supervision of the entire classroom without the use of artificial lighting. This is also true for any activity spaces in the program that are not classrooms. So this first image here on page left shows a wall level window in the classroom. which is typically what we're looking for. And even more so, and I think you'll see some examples coming up in future presentations today, having it at a low level so kiddos can actually see outside from their height. The second shows a solar tube, which yes, brings in some natural light, but is not located on a wall level, so it's no longer allowable. And the third image here shows a classroom that utilizes borrowed light from their neighboring spaces, but doesn't actually have direct access to that wall level window. So location of classrooms and the location of windows is crucial in early design phase. And classroom square footage. So let's talk a little bit about classroom square footage and group size. To me, this is probably the most important consideration when programming a space for size, the number of classrooms, and the efficiencies in plumbing. This chart on page left comes straight from DHS regulations that note maximum allowances for group size that are based on age and the required staff to child ratios. Preschool or school age classrooms must maintain a minimum of 35 square feet of usable space for each child. Infant and toddler classrooms must maintain a minimum of 45 square feet of usable space for each child. Some quick numbers to keep in mind are, infant rooms should be no smaller than 360 usable square feet minimum at the maximum group size of 8 kiddos. Toddler rooms should be 540 usable square feet minimum. And then preschool rooms with a maximum capacity of 18 should be 630 usable square feet minimum. Please notice how I keep emphasizing the word minimum. I'll get to that in just a bit. And you might have heard me reference usable square feet. So often we see floor plans that don't actually meet appropriate square footage because the design was not based on what's usable square footage. So what is usable? Basically anything in a space that allows for use by children can be considered as part of the usable square footage. Examples of usable space include children's cubbies, bookshelves, toy shelves, soft furnishings. Examples of non-usable space include storage closets, teacher workstations, closed storage cabinets, refrigerators, bathroom areas, including sinks and toilets. Even if they're located within the classroom, they cannot be considered. And then to be conservative, if you aren't sure if it's usable, don't include it in your square footage calculation, because the last thing you want is for DHS to come to your space, take a measurement, and then realize that you actually lose the capacity for a maximum group size because something wasn't deducted from the square footage. And again, as designers, we are striving to exceed the minimum required. So here's my obligatory plug going beyond 35 square feet per child. 35 square feet per child really is an arbitrary number. The classroom size standard has no foundation or relevance to the actual amount of space that's required to provide quality care for children. So 35 square feet is really inadequate to begin with. A 5 by 7 foot block is approximately double the size of just a playpen. And I know earlier in the presentation, Mike noted the similarities between prison design and educational design, but 35 square feet is actually half the space required for prisoners. The average child's room is about 120 to 140 square feet. In real research, what's really been seen is that the ideal standard should be 50 to 60 square feet. I know quite often space comes at a premium, and it's not the easiest thing to make sure that we're including the maximum allowance. Usually we're trying to carve as many corners as we can to fit everything that we can into every square inch. But, we really want to make sure that in order to get a high quality space, there needs to be enough space for kiddos to move. And each regulation kind of references compliance with the Consumer Product Safety Commission Playground Safety Handbook. And it's really straightforward as to what is safe and to what is not. But this is a huge safety issue. The greatest number of injuries happen on the playground that could result in death or dismemberment. And we still see in Rhode Island on a regular basis, level 1 safety hazards on site. But from the DHS regulations, each program is required to have an outdoor play area in the following ways: with at least 75 square feet of usable outdoor space per child, for at least 50% of the licensed capacity, or at least 75 square feet of usable outdoor space per child as designated by the department, as designated by a schedule for use too. So if you do have a constrained site, you could potentially size that outdoor space according to the maximum classroom capacity, as long as you have an approved schedule in place for that use. And if there is play equipment on site and it does require children's feet to leave the ground, it must be anchored to the ground. It must be maintained and in good repair in accordance with that Playground Safety Commission Playground Safety Handbook. And it must have safety surfacing that is maintained and in good repair in accordance with that Consumer Product Safety Commission Playground Safety Handbook guideline. And while I only went into detail about a few specific regulatory items, we definitely in design can't forget to consider the following. Things like classroom divisions and acoustics. While a 4-foot partition division is the minimum requirement, there really is a preference in spaces to have floor to ceiling walls. This helps enhance sound and mitigate noise, and it increases opportunities for learning and interaction. We want to think about artificial lighting. I know that, Mike did a really nice presentation on Lightscapes, and, it's not necessarily just about having the appropriate level for specific tasks like reading and music and art and having lighting on a desk surface, but it also includes having a variety of lighting with dimming capabilities that play off light and shadow and that have, the ability to create a dynamic space just from flicking a switch. And of course, we don't want to forget about things like our inspections and certifications. So making sure it's code compliant, that it has its fire inspection done, that it's lead free or safe, that it's asbestos free or safe, that it's radon safe. And then if there's a pool on site or if there's food that's handled on site, that they meet those safety regulations as well. And some of these inspections from a DHS perspective are viewed at the initial application for licensure, and then some of them have to be reviewed on an annual basis. So it's making sure that there is a longevity to the review and the health and safety of the materials in the space. And then of course, we talked a little bit about, a lot about classrooms and what was necessary for classrooms. But, of course, from a program design perspective, we don't want to forget about the non-classroom spaces, which would include spaces for administrative or clerical functions, storage of equipment and materials, storage of food, storage for anything really. I think that, one thing that we've learned over the years is that there is never enough space for storage in a childcare facility. And then of course you need a utility room that is separate from the kitchen with hot and cold water and storage space and storage space for cleaning equipment and supplies. And then, in our regulations, there is a call out specifically for general facility health and safety. But what does that really mean, right? So we are looking to make sure that the building and surrounds are free from hazards, that the area between parking and entry is free of obvious hazards as well, that there's a drop off and pickup location where children don't have to cross in front of moving vehicles, where the entrance has adequate working lighting. I won't read this whole list, but we just want to make sure that the facility is healthy and safe, that operable windows have secure screens, and that children are going to be in a safe environment and free from hazards in general. And one of the most nondescript requirements in licensing regulations is a note about buildings being generally in good condition and in good repair. The confusion that may come up is that the consensus on what that really means. And while I do believe the intent for the regulation is to become a little bit more prescriptive, we at the Facilities Fund have defined good condition and good repair in the following way. Thinking that the area is free of trash and debris, that windows and trim are in good condition, that the roof appears to be in good condition. I think one of the things that you can do is look inside a classroom space. If it has acoustic ceiling tiles and there are stains, that's to me a good indication that either there's something up with the HVAC system or there's something up with the roof. You want to make sure that the entrance and the parking area have good lighting, that the hallways meet the appropriate standards, that the flooring is in good repair or, and free of excessive wear. that the walls and floors are free of splinters and other apparent hazards, that there isn't peeling paint, that heating units, air conditioners, and other fixed features are intact and in good working condition, and that the plumbing is in good working condition. And all of these images that are shown below on the slide are actually images I've taken from doing review of childcare spaces. It's one of those things that, a lot of people didn't get into the childcare industry because they wanted to make a lot of money. What they really wanted to do is work with children. And, at the end of the day, one of the things that's really hard is in an operating budget is to set aside that funding for when there are things that need necessary repairs. So we work really hard on our end to make sure that there is funding available for health and safety improvements, But my pitch here is that at the end of the day, really, good design is already our best practice, and we should want to go beyond the baseline of our childcare licensing regulations. So with that, I will stop sharing. If people want to spend a couple of minutes and ask a couple of questions, maybe reflect on some of the things that we've talked about so far. Let's see, I'm going to do a quick view. Let's see. Oh, sorry, I'm just looking at the chat right now, if there was anything in the chat for any questions. Oh, I did get one question that came in. It came in privately. The question was, at what stage and when would you suggest that licensing gets looped in and invited to the design table? That's a great question, because I know that from the get-go, any childcare provider that as part of your licensing requirements, and when you submit an application for licensure, you have to submit a set of floor plans that are reviewed by the Department of Human Services. But there has never been a time that DHS has not wanted to be involved as early as possible. So I would say if you're a childcare provider or you're working with a childcare provider who is looking to take on a new space, Nicole Cello, who is the head of licensing at the department, has always wanted to go out on site and see this space even before it's acquired and even before it's developed and designed for childcare. But when it comes to the point where you have, I'm working, we have a group of architects here. So I would say probably as you're starting design development, that first phase of design, that's a good time to loop DHS in and have them take a look at it so that they are thinking thoughtfully about what impact they might have, not just on building code or on fire, but also the impact that's going to have on the specific licensing regulations, which are much more nuanced, I think, than you're going to get in your regular building code.
Aaron, I would also just add, I think that as you're going through your preliminary design, you can be identifying any gray areas or any questions that you have, so that those get flagged early, and then you document whatever the result is with a letter back to the licensor. Because there is always the possibility that one licensor comes and says, oh yeah, this is fine. And then another licensor comes and said, well, this doesn't look safe to me. And I think there are particular areas where there's more ambiguity than others. So certainly outdoor play areas, when you're dealing with natural play settings, it's important to explain, show images, talk about what your intentions are and how you're going to, how you're going to keep children safe and what kind of parameters you're using to design. I think that's really important. And then inside, I think a lot of it also will go towards supervision of a classroom. So if you have classrooms that are not simple shapes, for example, and you may want to just explain how supervision is going to work and work it out with the team that's operating the center, and then make sure that it's clear to the licensor ahead of time.
Yeah, and I would say, I think that, what we have heard for a number of years was about consistency in regulating the regulations and in the way that it's viewed from a compliance perspective. And I know that the department is working really hard right now in this next iteration of regulations to also come up with a consensus view on how they are determining how those regulations are interpreted. So I think that, your point about making sure that you're keeping track of what is being said by the regulator, you're hearing from licensing, that consistency is really key and something that I know is a goal of the department right now. So I think, I mean, people feel free to unmute and to share your video if you want to ask any questions. But if not, if there are no further questions, Mike, if you want to address the one that came up on sustainability.
Yeah, so Maria Rosa from Harmony Design and Construction wanted to know if we had any more information or reflections on biophilia and sustainability, integrating sustainability into projects. So I pulled up a few slides and a couple of things to talk about. I think she's hit on two things that are really, from our standpoint, very kind of cutting edge in terms of children's environments, thinking about how children interact with nature and how environmental stewardship can be learned at a young age, and how sustainability can be integrated into kind of preschool science and preschool literacy and all different aspects of a childcare program. I like this slide. This is about architecture and nature. So nature is the sky, and this down here is this is a tent. So this is architecture. This is in the Rocky Mountains on a starry night. And I think thinking about how our buildings and our built landscapes interact with the kind of the confluence of nature and then children experiencing, nature and experiencing the world is a really interesting challenge, really interesting problem. And sometimes it's kind of tangential to the main problems that we're setting out to solve in our projects, but I think it's really interesting in the way it can inform design as well. So this is an image of the project I showed a little bit of earlier, the Boston University Childcare Center, and this is a kind of a before image. This is the really nice yard I was talking about, and there was a garage in the yard, and this is the building in the distance. And the after photograph here shows the yard occupied with Playscape. You can see the addition that we built here in the foreground as well. And so the garage then was turned into what we call the play support building, because the preschoolers had to come from the second floor of the house into this wing, down the stairs, down a hallway, into the playground, because it was a little ways away. And because we had a garage here that didn't have another use really, we decided to create this playground support building, which included children's restrooms and a little kitchenette. But it also included a sort of indoor-outdoor science exploration and potting area, greenhouse area. So we felt that this was a place where the architecture and the landscape architecture can really connect. This is the view back. And this is, you may have seen this image before. But so just in terms of biophilia and connecting children with nature, it was a really important theme for this project, and the yard was where most of it happened, but the play support building was kind of the connection between the two. So there's a vegetable gardening area it's fenced, not to keep children out, but to keep turkeys and rabbits out, actually, in this case. And they have a pretty robust gardening program. They moved from another site where they already had a good gardening program, but not enough space. So here, this is sort of their idealized gardening space, gets good sun. And then the playground support building is next door. Whoops, I need that. This is looking out, and this is the dashboard that we developed. So there's a touchscreen computer in the play support building. And this is one technique that we used both to engage children and parents and teachers in the sustainable aspects of the building. So there's two screens you can click on, one for visitors, which is talks about the sustainable aspects of the building. So it's a LEED Gold building. and how that fits into Boston University's sustainability initiatives. And then in the classroom tab, it's ways for parents and children to understand the energy usage of the building. But in the interest of connecting more to nature, we also included tabs for things like harvesting vegetables. So they weigh all the vegetables that they harvest, and they track the number of days from planting to sprouting and things like that. They have a tab where they keep track of bird sightings and animals that they've seen on the playground. There's a weather tab. They do composting, so they track that. They actually weigh the recycling materials that they take out of each classroom. So the preschoolers actually take recycled paper and other products from the classroom to the central recycling area, and they weigh it, and then they log it in on this dashboard. So this is sort of one technique. I mean, we're trying to find ways to make the sustainable aspects of a project visible and tangible to children and parents and teachers, both, you know, so they see them and understand them and interact with them, but also so that it stimulates discussion and so it can be integrated into the curriculum. The other, and here you can see some more images. There's a kind of like a blog that goes along with it with photos that the kids and teachers take and post. Not much harvesting this week. So the second project I wanted to talk about, Sam, is this, can you see this full screen or is it cut off at the bottom?
I can see the full thing.
Okay, mine's cut off a little bit. But so this is the Penn State Hortwoods Childcare Center, and I think it illustrates a few different things. We talked a little bit about it earlier, but the siting of the building kind of is right on the edge of the woods, separating kind of the cooler woodsy space from the south-facing warmer part of the site. This section illustrates the way cool air is drawn in from the woods side of the building and then exhausted on the south side, coming through the classrooms. So there's a pretty sophisticated natural ventilation system that the children actually participate in. Now, there's also gardening on sunny south side, but also on there's a roof terrace, which is the best place for gardening from a sun exposure standpoint. This slide just talks about natural light and how that has a compound effect in terms of reducing energy usage for the building. I think a lot of things that are good for children and good for child development are also good for the earth and good for environment. So there's a lot of synergies between sustainability and quality childcare. And so I think harnessing those or making those evident is one of the things that we're really interested in. So these diagrams describe the natural ventilation system. It's a little bit of a Rube Goldberg thing, but I'll walk you through it. So there are temperature and humidity sensors outside. And when the temperature and humidity are appropriate for the natural ventilation system to function, which turns out to be a lot more often than we modeled, actually. So as I said, upwards of 120 days a year, they use the natural ventilation system as opposed to turning on the air conditioning. So it's all kind of free cooling. So what happens is the director, this is Linda, the director, she gets an email. And when she gets that email, she goes and opens these big sliding panels that face the cool north courtyard. Over here, there she is opening the panel. And then that triggers a green light in the classrooms. And when the children see the green light, they open sliding panels between the classroom and the hallway. This is in the hallway. And when they open those panels, that triggers these horizontal fans. These fans were manufactured to be placed vertically. They're low voltage destratification fans, but they actually have been mounted horizontally near these operable clerestory windows, which open automatically when the children open these panels. And that kind of helps to push air. So it's not completely, it's a hybrid system because it does have these little super low voltage fans that help it along. It also has in the stair tower, it has a couple of exhaust vents and fans that also help pull cool air through the building. And then here you see what they call Fanimations. These are the university art department came in and worked with the kids to make these mobile sculptures that when those fans go on, it activates the birds and the bugs. So this was a way of sort of integrating sustainability with the curriculum. Here you can see the panels that the children open between the classroom and the corridor. And the reason there's these decorative screens here, well, actually, so the grid is the screen just to keep people from throwing things through or kids from climbing through. And then these are actually free-form sliding panels. So that pattern, you can see this one's almost closed and this one's almost open. So those open up there. And this is a shot where you see these are the big sliding panels that the teacher or that the director opens on the cool north courtyard. Here you can see one of the preschool classrooms with these fans. We were also very conscious about integrating the building itself into the site. So the university and the university arborists were extremely protective of the existing trees. However, because this had been parking before, there was paving like right up to some of the bigger trees, which meant that the root system where the paving was already dead, basically. So we were actually able to build really close to some of these big trees. So it was pretty easy to sort of integrate the building into the woods. And then we were not allowed to pave or excavate at all in the wooded area. So this is all product called bonded rubber mulch, which is made of shredded tires kind of glued together. But it makes a soft surface and it makes a safety surface. We use that for pathways and for safety surfacing, but it's pervious to water and it doesn't impact the root system. So it was a very gentle way of going, working around the trees. Here you can see inside out, you can see just how we were able to build some of the mature trees. I think you've seen part of this slide before, but we used a lot of sustainable or recycled materials. Both of these pathways were made with just materials that we found on site. This had been the facilities department. It was an old small building from the 1960s that was torn down. But they had a lot of just materials stored on site that we reused. And then we used readily renewable materials like bamboo and cork as well. And once again, tried to find ways to explain those to the children. Another view from the outside, so you can see a lot of the play equipment is also sort of very light touch. So there's not big heavy pieces of equipment, and a lot of it is natural logs and stumps and sand. You can see right over here is actually a rain barrel. So this is a LEED Platinum building. And it has a rainwater harvesting system, which has a 6,000 gallon cistern underground, but also has 3 rain barrels, which are accessible to the kids with the rain chains. And that allows, so once again, all the water is recycled. The water that goes into the rain barrels is used by children to water plants. You can see a close-up of this spigot. And the other water that's collected in the big cisterns is used to flush toilets. But we made these sort of parallel and slightly redundant systems so that children could understand the rainwater harvesting component of that sustainable aspect of the project. I think the architecture also is intended to be very kind of simple in terms of like, it's pretty easy to explain to kids where the water is coming from, because you have these big sloped roofs here and the 2 kind of building block like forms with the water coming down between them. So you can, if you wanted to sort of replicate something like that with your block set, you could. So I think there's in addition to using materials and forms that are sympathetic with the rest of the Penn State campus, it's also intentionally meant to be sort of something that children can relate to. And here's just an example of sort of the richness of the outdoor environments and the way in which we're trying to really engage children with nature in all of its complexity, and just the kind of rich play experiences that can yield. Including worms. And I think that was it. So that's a little kind of a little tour of some of our thinking on biophilia and sustainability and integrating those into children's education. But it's a great question, and I think it's a really fertile place for exploration.
I mean, it sounds like it's a good opportunity for a presentation to include in next year's architect training that we do.
There you go. Well, there's.
We did have another question come in. So we had a question asking if you can mix 3, 4, and 5-year-olds in the same classroom. And with regard to the DHS licensing regulations, yes, you can. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to quickly share my screen right now and show you guys. Can you guys see the PDF here? This is the licensing regulations. I think you saw this chart here earlier in the presentation with staff and child ratios and group size and age integration. But if you continue through the regulation, they do have a section on how you can combine age groups in the following ways. So here you can have one option is with younger infants, older infants and toddlers mixed. You can have toddlers and preschool 3s mixed, so 3-year-old preschoolers, and you can have 3, 4s, and 5s mixed. What I will say is that when you do mix your age groups, you're going to have to follow the maximum group capacity of the youngest age group. So if you're mixing infants and toddlers, your maximum group size can be no greater than 8. And if you're mixing preschoolers that are 3, 4, and 5, I think when you get to the 4 and 5s, you can have a group size of 20, but with 3s, you can have a group size of 18. So just as you're looking to plan out spaces, you can mix age groups, but you're going to have the more stringent group size capacity.
I'd say another kind of follow-up to that is when you're thinking about flexibility over time in terms of how the classrooms may or may not be used. Between 3-year-olds and 5-year-olds, there's not a lot of difference between the way the classes are fit out and designed. But what we like to think about is if you have multiple classrooms of each age group, so at least one of the classrooms between ages is sort of designed as a swing space. So for example, if you have 2 infant rooms, maybe one of them is adjacent to a toddler bathroom so that you could eventually, if the infant room became a toddler room, you could connect to that toilet for that age group to make that work better as a toddler room. Or one of the toddler rooms, to make sure that it's sized so that you can also accommodate crib space, so that if that toddler room needed to become an infant room, there's a way to do that conversion. We've also designed pairs of toddler rooms together and with shared bathroom in such a way that you could just kind of take the wall down between the two and make it into a single preschool room. And sometimes that's about just getting the square footage right so that you could accommodate a full class of the older or the younger group size, depending.
Yeah, and I'll add a comment. So Kara Rocha from DHS just actually said that along with group size, you also have to follow the child to teacher ratio of the youngest child. And Kara, I will say, is also an expert because she is also a former child care director as well. So I know that ratios are something that are really, really important when considering the building's operation and kind of the operational business model that it takes place for the number of staff that people have to hold for those types of spaces. It looks like Harmony Design, you have your hand up.
Yes, thank you, Erin. Basically, what I would like to make aware is, in our case, perhaps the clients I have been experiencing, they apply for this fund, particularly right here in Rhode Island, for everybody who is out of Rhode Island, perhaps, in that clarifications, are pretty much like a home-based daycares. So being into the constraints of have a home-based daycare, we have different situations. My background in architecture and project management, I love to do designs. I have been doing schools and so forth and so on, but it's totally different set of constraints we have when it's a home daycare, because these spaces have to be functional and have to be flexible. And the fact that people are actually living in the same place and they want to have, after the kids go home, they want to have a regular, normal house, functional house, functional space. Most times these ladies have the daycare is in the living room, and maybe sometimes even a bedroom perhaps, or some other times are in the basements. They are adaptable in with all the codes in order to have them in those spaces perhaps, but it's not like they utilize the whole one floor for the daycare. It's not like that, or it's not like a building specifically for the daycare. No, it's pretty much the living room with the dining room together, and then the kitchen of the house become, like the centerpiece for doing the meals for the kids. And then after they go down, some live in the first floor, some in the third floor, some in the second floor. And then you have the constraint that kids go down and they become into the playground. Playground is now become actually the parking lot of the house and a little bit of the backyard of the house. These are houses, in our case, in Rhode Island, from Providence, which is the city, and a small city, a beautiful city in our state. For who is not from here, they are older houses, and they presenting all these constraints. A lot of them they have let because it's not before 1978. So all these items that I just get a mouthful again. Can you guys please have highlights or any insight regarding creative ways to be able to accomplish these goals?
Well, Maria Rosa, you have really good questions, I have to say.
Thank you. Appreciate
So
it.
this might be something where our CDFI participants might want to chime in as well, because in my mind, I think a lot of what the questions you're asking actually are policy questions as well, because I think that the big challenge with home childcare is a lack of funding and a lack of models for people to follow, and it's such a small scale retail space that it's difficult, I think, to have the same focus. I mean, it's difficult for all childcare centers, right, to get good design and adequate funding and all of the things that it would take to really do a really high quality system. But it's even more difficult, I think, for home care providers. And some people do an amazing job, but it's very hard to find information about the people doing amazing jobs too. And it's and there's not I think there are ideas out there for ways of doing things like sharing services and facilities between home providers, such as playgrounds. And I think there are really interesting possibilities for designing spaces that can be converted from living spaces to childcare spaces more easily and more readily. But I don't think there's a good, that I'm aware of, I don't think there's a good program for promoting that or facilitating that really right now. I mean, I'm sure there must be examples out there, but.
Well, Mike, sorry, Erin.
No, that's okay. I think the one thing I will say is, obviously family childcare is something that we are really, really focusing a lot on here in Rhode Island, as far as making sure that it's a much more integrated system in how we're approaching design and how we're approaching funding and how we're approaching accessibility. So stay tuned for more to follow on family childcare design. But the one thing that I will say is we definitely want to be really thoughtful of the fact that family childcare was never intended to be mini centers, right? It's never intended to be a design place that is just a small classroom setting, just like a childcare center. It really is a parental choice to have somebody within a home that feels like a home. And so a lot of it, there's a lot that can go into what that means as far as the flexibility of the space, the use of the space from day to night, and the way in which the regulations address that. And there is a separate set of family childcare regulations through DHS. It's not the same set of regulations that center-based or school-age-based programs have. So I'm so glad that you're so attuned to that and that you are working with family childcare providers on their space, because I think that we're going to see a lot over the coming, year around that.
I do appreciate it. And thank you, Erin. Thank you, Mike. And I think the Erin is trying to help the home daycares mothers to be able to actually get into the next gear, perhaps. And I think that that's a great intention. I'm so glad and actually very pleased to be part of it. Especially because of my background and you guys are in tune what I will believe and what I actually express and it's my coro. So I do appreciate it and I'm so excited to maybe next year after we working in a couple of the projects we can present it to them and get a
Thank
model for
you.
the home daycares.
Thanks,
That would be
Medeiros.
awesome. Thank you.
Aaron, I see one more question from Susanna on existing non-conforming spaces. Maybe we can talk a little bit about that before we go to a break. And this is a tricky one, which I think almost needs to be dealt with on a case-by-case basis with your licensor. From my understanding, from a building code and a accessibility standpoint, if you have an existing non-conforming space that's been approved, it would be a priority to upgrade it, but not a requirement. And I think from a licensing standpoint, I will let Aaron or someone else answer that. Kara, maybe.
Yeah, I mean, I think what ends up happening where these changes in regulations get triggered if there is a change in ownership or a change in license. So if it's a currently non-conforming space, it is, and it has been already approved, it's not going to get triggered to have to make that adjustment. And I think from like an infant toddler space specifically, if it has an exit door on grade to the exterior, it does, but does require stairs. While you want to make the best ability to provide accessibility to the playground, it is not something that's going to be triggered as a requirement through licensing regulations. But that's something that's really a good thing to bring up when you have a preliminary design review meeting with the department, because those are the things that we're going to want to think about from a long-term perspective.
And if you are upgrading or expanding or doing anything that requires a building permit or additional licensing, then it's a great question to ask as well, because then it might be triggered. And I would also say if whatever the non-conformance is, if it represents a real safety hazard, then that's a different story. And because that's kind of a judgment call, it is the kind of thing where you could have one building inspector, for example, who says, "Oh, this is fine," and another building inspector who comes in and says, "No, this is dangerous. You have to fix it." So.
Just want to say thank you. I know that's a tricky specific one, but finding similar things happen all the time in some of the quirky existing centers that we're looking at, and it's hard to know what once you start improving something, how far you absolutely have to take it. It's a bit of a challenge.
Yeah, no, and I appreciate, Suzanne, that you've taken on some very interesting projects in childcare in Rhode Island. And the one thing that I always like to mention is, like, because of Rhode Island's age and because of Rhode Island's size, it's not always feasible to, construct a project from the ground up. So we have to get really creative in some of our existing spaces, and that can create a lot of, uncomfortable conversations from a regulation perspective, but they're always good ones to have. I mean, but because the DHS regulations are opened every 3 years, there have been modifications made when there have been, opportunities arise, just going through this concept and feasibility study in some of these weird and quirky spaces. So always appreciate you taking a stab at those things, Suzanne.
Well, they're fun puzzles too, so I enjoy them. Thank you.
So I think with that, feel free to jump in if you have any other questions. We've got a couple of minutes. Our intent for the next session is to take a break from noon to 12:30, and we'll hop on for a quick half-hour discussion. That's going to be a LISC-led discussion where I'm going to tell you a little bit about who LISC is and what we do and how we service the state of Rhode Island as well as the rest of the country. And then also talk about some of the emerging opportunities that we're seeing in Rhode Island around childcare infrastructure. So I look forward to you joining us for that. And then after that, at 1 o'clock, we have what I'm thinking is going to be my favorite part of the program, which is a deep dive into some of the case studies in childcare spaces.